Welcome to episode number 3 of Stories and Sips. My name is Barry Chandler. I'm a Cork man in Ohio, helping introduce unsuspecting Americans to the joys of Irish whiskey. Today's episode, Irish Whiskey, Tell Me Your Story. And today's video is for those new to Irish whiskey, as well as those new to the world of distilling. Today's story will be accompanied by a lovely sip, West Cork's bourbon cask blend, a lovely little sip. And as always, thank you to Irish Whiskey Magazine for their support of this episode. If you haven't subscribed to the voice of the Irish whiskey industry in Ireland, a beautiful print production that comes out 4 times a year, I encourage you to do so. Head over to www.irishwhiskeymagazine.com and please subscribe and support them. 15 years ago, I worked on ships and I would spend 4 to 6 months at a time away from home. And when I did come home, I'd love spending time with family, and one of the things I really enjoyed doing was taking a trip to Midleton with my dad. We grew up in Cove, only a 20-minute drive from the distillery, and we'd love walking around the old grounds of the distillery. And I love that intersection of the old history of the distillery, where so much of Ireland's whiskey history lives, and then the intersection with the new distillery and the gift shop with its gleaming bottles and bright lights shining down on amazing labels that hark back to a past generation. Long before I could tell the difference between pot still and blends, between sherry casks or bourbon casks, I fell in love with the stories of Midleton and the stories of the distillery beyond just the liquid. Midleton Very Rare and Redbreast are my favourite whiskies today, not just to drink, but to look at, to hold, to remind me of those amazing trips to the distillery. If you're new to Irish whiskey and you haven't yet had the chance to visit Ireland or visit the distilleries, the range of options to choose from can be daunting, can't it? How will you choose based on these fancy labels that you see on the bottles, these funny new bottle shapes that are coming out? Or is it from the bold claims that you see on the labels from companies that maybe don't even have a distillery? I mean, some labels have age statements, some have signatures. How will you choose? Well, my recommendation is to do a little bit of research on a whiskey that maybe somebody recommended for you, or a whiskey that you've got your eye on. Do a cursory Google search and include the word history or story when you do a search. Maybe there's stories behind that whiskey that you're not aware of. Maybe you have an Irish ancestry. Maybe you know where your people came from. Maybe they came from an area that's producing whiskies today. Maybe they came from an area that historically produced whiskies but no longer does. In any case, by looking a little deeper beyond the label, beyond the claims on the whiskey label or on the bottle, you may discover some stories that help you connect a little bit deeper to the whiskey and to the brand, and help you have more of a connection to what it is that you're buying. And a distillery or a brand doesn't have to be 200 years to be meaningful or to have an amazing story. I love the amazing story of the 3 fishermen in West Cork who started the distillery of their own and now employ half the town working for the distillery. That's a great story and is meaningful to me coming from Cork. But there are stories everywhere when you search for the truth and the provenance behind the label. Because marketing is easy. It's easy to slap a nice label or a fancy message on the bottle, but the truth and the provenance behind the label can be far more interesting and something to help you connect a little bit deeper with that whiskey. And then the great thing about falling in love with a whiskey or the story of a whiskey is that you're going to want to tell somebody else about that whiskey, and you're going to want to share that story, and you're also going to want to share that sip. And whiskey does not taste half as good unless you're with friends and you're with people that you can share stories with. Today I shared the stories of 6 amazing whiskies with 18 unsuspecting Americans who had never been to Ireland, who surprisingly had no Irish heritage. Out of 18 people, nobody had Irish ancestry. But they listened to my Stories and Sips team building presentation today in Irish Whiskey Tasting. They learned about Ger Buckley and his Cooper's Crows and him being the 5th generation of Cooper. They learned about Barry Crockett. They learned about the amazing history of pot still whiskey. And by the end of the tasting, they were leaving asking me where can they buy a bottle of Redbreast 12-year-old. They fell in love with the stories behind Irish whiskey, and they didn't even have a connection with Ireland. If you run a new distillery in Ireland, of course you don't have the 200-year head start of Jameson or Powers. You probably don't have 5 generations of a family that have worked for your distillery, but you don't have to. So when it comes to telling the story of your distillery or the story of your whiskey, you really have two choices. You can share your vision for the future that you see, your vision for the future of the brand, for the whiskey of Ireland. You can share with me the struggles that you've gone through to establish your distillery, or maybe the beliefs or the things that drove you to start this business in the first place. You can document the process of making the whiskey. And it doesn't matter if you source the whiskey or you're distilling it yourself. There are amazing stories behind the work you're doing. You can share the human stories of your struggle, the human stories of where you fell down, you got back up again, and you can help me connect humanly to your whiskey, to your brand, and to the work that you're doing, and make me feel part of it. Or you can sit down with a marketing firm for an afternoon in a room, and you can conjure up the most fanciful tales of mythical characters, and you can put beautiful prose on your label, and hopefully you'll convince somebody to buy the whiskey. I urge you to choose the former. I urge you to help us all understand the realities of your business, the truth of your business, what's really going on in your business, whether you're bottling, bonding, distilling, it doesn't matter. The stories, the real stories behind your business are far more interesting than anything that could possibly be dreamed up. Don't be a fancy label and a fancy bottle. Be a story worth sharing, a human story. There was a lot of conversation recently about the prices that Teeling's pot still whiskey achieved at auction, and there were questions as to whether this was the new price for pot still whiskey in Ireland and whether this would affect the price of whiskey. But the reality is that the prices commanded were not for a 3-year-old pot still whiskey. Those prices were commanded for a story of Dublin's rebirth, the story of pot still whiskey coming out of Dublin for the first time in almost 50 years, a story of the Teeling family and the generations of them that have distilled in Dublin and across and around Ireland. In the words of the author Raymond Chandler, which adorned the visitor centre at Bow Street in Dublin, the Jameson Visitor Centre, a good story cannot be devised, it has to be distilled. And I would add to that to say, make sure that you're distilling it from facts, not fiction, because when you do distill it from the real truth behind your business and the real humanity of your business, you're going to attract my attention for a lot longer. I'm Barry Chandler, an Irishman in Ohio, celebrating the stories and sips of Ireland's extraordinary whiskies. And now it's time for me to enjoy a sip of Ireland's extraordinary whiskey myself, with a drop of West Cork bourbon cask, Sláinte. Cheers, boys.